good that you were able to connect with me. Um, Maybe for those viewing at home, if you could just give us a brief introduction of who you are and how you got to be where you are and where you work right now, that would be amazing.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's so great to talk to you. My name's Aaron Wheeler. I started out in tech here in Seattle about 8 years ago. I started working for an online marketing startup called Moz, SEO Moz, back at the time. And honestly, I started by just helping them with the gig. I was moving them in, and then I had built computers, worked in that space for a little bit when I was younger, and so I eventually moved into customer service there. Then I started managing because it was such a small team and we were growing. So I managed some of the customer service team, and that kind of grew and grew over the years. And after 4 years, I decided to take a break and do some creative work. And while I was doing that, acting doesn't exactly pay super well. So I started
What
contracting.
depends. If you're really good at pace, or if you're really famous, at least you don't really
Yeah,
have to
yeah.
do
So if you're in like the 0.0001, it
it.
pays
Exactly.
great.
Yeah.
And then otherwise you're making $2 an hour driving or whatever.
Oh yeah,
So
you're probably an Uber driver when
yeah.
you're acting, right?
I tried task rabbiting.
Oh yeah.
It's after you work a job that pays a normal amount, it's very challenging to do that. And I feel really lucky and privileged that I have these other opportunities.
Skills. Yeah.
Yeah, so I learned how tough that is, and I'll probably try again someday. But at the time, I started consulting and helping out this company, Wistia, that does video hosting over in Boston. And I really loved their team. I loved the person who I was working with at the time, Jeff Vincent, who used to run that team. And they had me fly out and do some stuff in person, and eventually it was just like a great fit. And my wife and I decided to move over there for a couple of years. So I went there as their director of customer happiness. But that was a really large team. We grew it from 8 people to about 20 doing support and success. And when you have 20 people out of the 60 at the company, now 80, you end up doing a lot of HR. And so many things emerged, like the way that we did interview practices, the way that we did recruiting. The way we scaled people up and helped them get skills that they needed to grow in. It just was becoming clear that that's something I really enjoyed and I was pretty good at, especially like relative to other things that caught my interest. So I took a course at the Harvard Extension School, and I just started formally taking on more projects. The first project was developing, kind of taking what we had in customer happiness and putting it across the company. So the way that we did annual reviews, which was pretty well standardized compared to other teams, that went really well. And it took a lot of work. I'm still working on iterating on that, but we decided, because that went pretty well, that it made sense with my new training to move into HR. So I partnered with our director of people ops. I became a director of HR and kind of owned the more process, policy development side of things, as well as eventually taking on a HR business partners program and diversity and inclusion and employee engagement, which is more what I'm doing now. So yeah, it's feels very startup-y. This amazing, just find what you're good at and keep growing up, keep scaling and figuring out what you're great at and what you love. And I feel really fortunate I've been able to do that there.
I guess you are.
Yeah.
But so we're doing these masters in HR interviews to, you know, um, share some of the new skills and kind of projects that HR needs to do in this age of rapid change and in this age where HR is required to be more strategic. It used to be only recruiting and administration. Right now, it's so much more than that. And you are fortunate enough to work in such an environment where all of that is like standards. You work with, I guess, only digital natives, only people that really know how these online tools work, and they think in terms of digital solutions, automation, that kind of stuff. So that's why it's interesting to hear your perspective on some sort of things. So could you maybe share some of the projects that you did since you became an HR person, some of the more interesting things, maybe something you're proud of?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but it's true. And I think that in some ways, it raises the expectations of people at the company. So like all of our senior leadership, they're all people who not only is our product for, people in a uh, digital
World.
environment, yeah, digital world.
Yeah, all that.
It's video, and actually our mission of our company, Make Business More Human, is largely about taking humanity and putting it on the internet. I mean,
Yeah,
that's what Google has done. Look at any cat video and that's what it's there for.
exactly.
Yeah, and what we're able to do now and show people ourselves, our personalities. So the expectations are really high from their perspective, but I think they're also high from my own. I know what it means to show success, to be like successful in achieving a goal in this landscape. It's a lot more challenging because there's just so much out there that you can work on. So I'd say one of the first projects that became clear we needed to work on was being able to use data to make arguments, which is a pretty standard thing in HR now, but the past few years we've seen this rapid growth in HRIS processes and tools, and we've really benefited from that. So that first project where I decided to take what we had in customer happiness, build on it, and then create a new annual performance review process for the company. Performance reviews are pretty well standardized. There's a great conversation around whether or not they're, whether you should have them or not, what the process should look like. But there's so much tooling out there that can pull in from so much data that I actually feel like if you decide to have them, they're going to be significantly better than they ever have been before. And you need to have feedback some way. So that project was really exciting for a few reasons. So I got to work with the senior management on it, basically every team lead and every department, figure out what their problems were with their process, figure out how titles worked on their teams, whether they used them or not. That's a whole philosophical thing we went through.
So did you, in the end, use titles or not?
Yeah. So we used titles in a pretty standardized way. We created a level system. And it was probably overkill, it's more than we need for a team of 80. We were trying to build something scalable. I think that's one thing I learned. Definitely don't do that.
You mean don't make too many titles?
Well, no. Yes, don't make too many titles, but I imagine most people get in the trap that I did, which is because we know that we're going to be growing at some point, you try and build it for scale. And this is something I've heard a lot, like Airbnb, they talk about this a lot. Don't build for scale, just build it. And it will scale, or you'll build something new as that becomes necessary. Now, if you know you're gonna hire double in the next 6 months, then you really have to consider it. But we spent a lot of time building okay, what's 1 through 10 on this levels chart? And then what are your titles for each of those levels? What are the criteria for each of those levels? And that probably was more work than we needed to do and created more confusion. However, it did help us kind of get into this organized framework where it was clearer to employees, hey, this is the next level and this is how I get there. And managers now had a framework to talk about that instead of just having ad hoc, anniversary-based, conversations that weren't formalized. The data part ties into the platform we decided to use called Trackstar. And Trackstar is just, it's an online tool you can use for performance reviews. There's a ton out there. We're probably going to use 15 fives pretty soon instead, or complementing that. And one of the reasons I love Trackstar is not only can you have all of that performance review stuff organized in one set, so that it makes approvals easier for HR. It makes looking through things and comparing them easier for HR. It makes employee acknowledgement easier. You also get to this next level where instead of just looking at them piecemeal, you can start getting that system sense. So Trackstar has a feature that lets you look at all of the different reviews for every single employee in that review period and then compare them. So you can finally start asking questions like, are these reviews fair? Are each manager Is each manager actually applying the same standards on their teams? Are some managers more gracious than others in the way that they evaluate stuff? Are some less so? Is there some bias based on your gender, or if you're a person of color, or if you're white? Does that affect something? So as we're getting more, I'll talk about this, but as we're getting more into thinking about diversity and inclusion in tech, this is becoming incredibly important to measure. And really the only way you can do it effectively is by having it organized in a system. So that project was something I was really excited about for just all these reasons. It's about employee growth. It's about looking at things from a systems level. It's about having standards and understanding your systems instead of just kind of putting a black box out there and saying, okay, give me a review score.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And so to your point of scalability, maybe just coming back to what you said earlier, right? What's the most important reason for just building what you have for what you have right now instead of trying to predict what you're gonna have if you grow, over 100 people, for example? Isn't that what like HR has been doing for a while now, trying to predict what people will need instead of offering what is needed right now and then just being agile about it and updating it every now and then? Is that what you would say is the biggest takeaway there?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Just in leadership thinking, I see like an HBR article once a day now about stop going so deep into planning, right?
Yeah,
And you
right.
see this with OKRs, you see this with other systems that we use for planning goals, but it is true. We are terrible at predicting what will happen in the future. And, 1 out of the 100 companies that say they're going to double by the end of the year actually will. Most of them won't. Most of them don't need to do that work. So you actually end up doing a bunch of work that doesn't ever help anyone and creates a lot of stress for you because you're maintaining a more complex system. One of the values of Wistia is simplicity. And I think that that's one of the hardest. It's actually one of the hardest things to do. It's the same thing where I would have written you a letter that was half as long, but it would have taken me like double the time. Time.
It's actually one of my favorite quotes. You can ask around, but it's true.
Yeah, really?
Yeah, the way I say it is, I've written you a short letter. I've written you a long letter because I didn't have the time to write you a short one.
Right. That's the one.
That's the point, right?
Forget who says it. It's great.
And so if you start like this new HR project, such as that engagement project that you mentioned, we don't want to do too much planning, but we do need to assess like the first need or the minimal viable need. We need to buy perhaps a software sometime. So how do you start it?
Yeah, I really think that there's a gap in tech and tech leadership. I am guilty of this as well. I don't think that we're great at listening, and I don't think that we're great at removing ourselves from what we're hearing. So, as leaders, it's incredibly important for us to learn as much as we can about ourselves and develop that self-awareness on an ongoing basis, so that you really understand what your motivations are when you're listening to other people. Because the best thing that you can do to develop a system that people love and is motivating is to listen and hear what their needs are. You should go out and ask. And, I like surveys. I think that they're good. They're super efficient. But if you can argue, like if you can show results from taking the time to actually do interviews and interview someone from each team, interview a people manager, interview an individual contributor, interview one of the C-levels, you're going to get a significantly better solution because you've actually done that interviewing. And every company does this for their customers. Like, you do customer interviews. That's a pretty standard thing in tech, at least. But we don't really do it for employees, which is strange because, your employees are a pretty important customer to HR. I think it's just that we don't have time. So if you can advocate for and show that you get better results by doing these kinds of interviews and this research, I think that you'll develop something that is a lot more relevant now, instead of building for these hypothetical people that you'll be hiring in a year that you might not ever end up hiring. So that's something I feel pretty strongly about. listening and understanding the use cases. It's kind of, maybe it's coming from the customer service background, but it's a problem across the board.
I mean, I think that there's no better background to start in HR than that kind of background, to be honest, because if you know customer centricity, you know employee centricity, and then you can start designing these kind of processes. But
Yeah.
and so you do these interviews, and then what comes next? So you launch an MVP or you pilot a product, and then you go back and do interviews every time, or do you automate that? Do you use surveys? What happens next? Like, give us the example of the employee engagement project that you're doing right now, for example. What's happening there?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing another big project that we worked on last year that I'm super excited about is employee engagement surveys, and doing it on a regular basis. And so we have done it on a regular basis every quarter, and it's become a pretty systematic, expected thing. So some of the stress is taken out of it, and employees kind of know what to expect. We use a tool called Culture Amp. It's wonderful. I highly recommend it. And yeah, so what we did there was we initially heard from employees that there were some gaps. There were some gaps in how they were feeling about, how some people felt about what the company was up to, how engaged they were, versus, some other people who felt like really positive. And when we first heard that, we heard it through like proactive communication from employees. So we started doing this employee engagement survey and asking specific questions in there. And after the first one, we saw that, like every company struggles with this. It's not just us, but there is a gap in inclusion. So some groups of people, some demographics have a better experience at Wistia than others. And we weren't sure why. It didn't make sense from our existing perspective. So once you like take some of the stress out of that, what we did was we created a work group. We called it the Sequoia Squad. And we met once a week, and we made sure that anyone who wanted to join it could. And we started talking a lot in these meeting formats, trying to hear what the problems were. We even created this like monster Trello board. I would never recommend anyone do it this way. We created like a Trello board of 100 different problems, distinct problems, and then we talked about what we'd want to fix. So I think in that case, we actually listened quite well. We put out things in Slack and said, hey, please contribute to this board if you have any questions. Let us know. If you have any problems, add it to the board. We did some interviews. We did another survey where we asked like, hey, what did you think about this engagement survey? Did you think that this process went well? Kind of feedback on the reviews. We had just launched the reviews at the same time. What did you think of the reviews? So some of these things you just have, when you have 80 people, you're just not going to get a representative sample unless you survey. But I found that the surveys worked well, and they did reinforce some of the stuff that we learned in that broader kind of town hall format.
Yeah,
so that was good.
And so you didn't even you didn't limit yourself to asking people in the beginning what their needs were. You just literally involved them in the project. They were part of the project team. Is that something that you will do in the future as well for other projects?
I think so. I don't know for sure yet, so I don't want to say this like as a
commitment.
But I do think that 90% of most of these problems are process. It's not about the end solution. It's about how you're getting there. We know this from some of the earlier like D&I stuff, diversity and inclusion stuff. So, Project Include does a lot on how you run meetings and how you're aware of yourself so that you're not causing as many microaggressions, experiences from other people. And that's really about, you get to a better, more engaged, more goal achieving culture by valuing and honoring these process changes in a way that's not necessarily tied to the outcome. Like we can't say for sure by including everyone in a meeting and having a venue for everyone to speak that will lead to a more innovative product. I can't say that, for sure. There's a little bit of research on that. But I think that it's pretty self-evident that including everyone that's on your team in the conversation will lead to something more nuanced with more perspective than not doing that. And so I think as much as we can, creating just expectations out front. Hey, like I'm the person directly responsible for implementing this stuff. but I want input from everyone. And just because I don't directly take or implement the thing that you're specifically asking for, doesn't mean that it wasn't valuable or it didn't contribute to the process, because the process of learning, this interviewing, the surveys, all of that, that is leading to something inherently better just by virtue of us doing it. You got to act on stuff too. But I found that the process is something that we don't focus enough on. And I think if we do, it will lead to the change we want to see.
HR is the ultimate product manager, aren't they?
Yes. Yes. You have the biggest team. You have the hardest to measure outcomes.
Yeah. So I think product management skills should be like in the top 5 of, you know, skills that HR people want to learn.
I totally agree.
So did you get any feedback on that project already? Because you mentioned that it's been going on for a while. So maybe some reactions of people. What's happening over there? That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about how it's evolved. So we did that initial survey. We did that survey on surveys. We made some changes to the reviews process, and then we kept doing it. So every quarter we've done it again, and our engagement has actually gone down as a group in some ways. And I will say I'm excited because at this point we have started narrowing the gaps in demographics. Hard to attribute precisely why. There's some things with retention. There's some things with actual like positive change we've seen. We're talking a lot more about inclusion. I think that has a big effect. But I guess the process for me has been, we set up those quarterly reviews. We set up those quarterly employee surveys. Then we set up a weekly office hours where people could come and talk to me or my partner anytime they wanted. But there's a specific time on the calendar where you can come and talk to us about anything privately, just called People Ops Office Hours. So that was really helpful for me and my partner to better understand the inclusion issues from different perspectives. Then we realized, hey, when we initially set up these surveys, we didn't actually have demographics in here. So there's no way for us to see, what team are you on? What age are you? What's your tenure? Some of that's kind of built into the solution that we used, Culture Amp, but we don't have data about people's self-identified gender or whether or not they identify with a certain, what ethnicity they identify with. Do they identify as LGBTQ? So there's a bunch of different parts of people's identities that we just didn't have on record. And it's kind of challenging to ask for that. So what we did was we set up a separate survey. It sounds like a lot of surveys, and it was too much, but I still think it's valuable. We collected that information. We had about 70% participation. So most employees shared their, how they identify. And that was really humbling to me and really surprising. I think that we did some good things about, we talked about the fact that we would honor privacy. This wouldn't be going out to like a big group of people. It's going to be kept very narrowly in the scope of HR and our data and how we protect our data. It would be used in a very limited way. We would only be using it to see what the groups in our surveys, how the groups in our surveys differentiated from one another, and then maybe a diversity report. But we were pretty clear about what we're going to use it for up front. And so we collected that data, and I knew in Q3, Q4, we were going to start developing our HRIS system. So we were moving from Dropbox to, files and scans to a legit system, to Bamboo HR. Mm. And I was the one in charge of, a couple great coworkers of mine developed that solution as like the solution. This is the thing we should use. But after that, I was in charge of implementation. And it was clear to me that like, hey, there's going to be some way where we can take all of our data about all of our employees and put it in there, add in a protected set of like people seeing this demographic data, and you will end up with this extremely robust data set that you can then use engagement surveys with to classify questions and answers in this much more nuanced way. Yeah. Like, what do young people who are LGBTQ experience at Wistia compared to other people? And that really, so, there was 6 months of developing Bamboo HR. It was just one of many projects. It took a while for me to finish. And I still have some peers working on that with me. But I found that being able to have one place to deposit all that, which, is pretty that's a pretty straightforward thing, but it was revelatory to me. It gave us a lot more motivation to fix things. Like, I don't think if we hadn't combined those things and created surveyable, groups, we would have any of the diversity and inclusion work happening now that we have. And I don't think that we ever realized that link, because we moved so fast in HR that it's like, oh, you take everything for granted.
Yeah. No, and seeing results also motivates, right? So I
yeah, absolutely.
Get what you're saying. All right, good. And so maybe to go to a different path, you support leaders in a context that's very techy, that's very fast moving, that's in a scalable company. How do you support those leaders? How do you support those managers? Do you do anything specific?
Yeah. So we started a program, basically HR business partner program, back in, I want to say October and November. And, the plan was we would have at least monthly check-in with the people managers of different teams, also check in with those teams, and help kind of try and move away from being reactive to the problems that we were seeing to being proactive and coming up with solutions before things got into a place where we had to be reactive. Excuse me. So instead of, for instance, instead of letting something become a performance improvement plan situation, we would just identify that there was some, skill that wasn't being expressed in a role, and then help that person with that skill now before it started really, affecting their performance. So that was really exciting. I think we've done some really great stuff with that, but ultimately we weren't super successful. And we've kind of stopped doing it that way. But I'll tell you a little bit about how we got there. So for some managers, there just is emergent issues every week. So I would talk to one of our team's managers about feedback and how they're able to give and receive it with a couple different employees who really have strong opinions, but aren't really seeing the bigger context and are having a hard time taking the feedback from their manager. So we would have these coaching conversations, and we talk for an hour or two, have a walk around the block, and even do some role playing. And I probably did that with 2 or 3 managers, and I found it really helpful. It helped me better understand their problems, better understand some of our employees. I think they found it helpful because they could move forward with those conversations more strongly. But that kind of thing was basically the height of that HR business partner program. We never really got it further than this consulting oriented basis.
Oh yeah.
One of the teams we created growth paths, and that was really helpful. But largely it kind of became just a check-in that managed the performance improvement plans, employee exits if we had to do that. It was very challenging to turn it into a proactive program.
Yeah.
I think that the coaching was super valuable.
It turned a little operational, did it, those meetings?
It did. I think that happens because we haven't really figured out what problem we're trying to solve. When the problem is so broad that I want to make these reactive conversations proactive, that's not nearly as helpful as hey, manager, or hey, senior leadership. We want to stop having any performance improvement plans, because before we get to that place, we're always going to have a conversation about someone's performance. That really sets it up. Managers have so much to manage. You really have to choose one thing and then work on that thing until you've gotten good at it. You can't do this blanket, I'm going to work on 10 things with this person, growth paths, avoiding performance improvement situations, working on comp, working on recruiting, all that stuff. It's very challenging to do all of that at once.
Yeah, it is. And I think that a lot of leadership programs fail because of that reason. It's a big catalog of different, 100 different skills they have to learn, whilst they should focus on the 4 most important elements, for example. All right. So, and maybe a difficult question, I don't know. What do you think is the most important difference in terms of supporting leadership in a very tech-based company as opposed to a traditional company because they manage differently? Do you feel like they should be supported differently as well?
Did you say a very tech-based company?
Yes, so a very digital company, a scalable, agile with sprints, that kind of stuff, as opposed to a company that works in a very yearly manner with job descriptions and that kind of stuff.
Yes, absolutely. um, and I think that's something I could have done more advocacy for over time. I feel pretty good about where we are now, but I do strongly believe in coaching. I think that coaching is really an important part of a manager's like toolbox and getting that coaching and being able to talk to someone about problems, especially like role playing difficult conversations because things move so quickly. At least at the two tech startups I've worked at, they move so quickly. Like I I really can't convey how much change happens in like 2 weeks.
Yeah,
And
it's
we've
amazing.
tried to regiment them.
I know.
Like,
If I go on a holiday for 1 week and I get back, I'm always like, "What is this? A different company? What's happening here?" It's so
yeah,
crazy.
it kind of is. Like you can have all the goals change.
Yeah,
Or some customer set suddenly has like some issue and then everything's focused on that.
yeah,
Uh, and those emergent issues will always show someone's like deficiency, and so then the managers always have to act on that deficiency somehow, or they feel they do. So you're kind of in crisis mode all the time, and I don't think that I don't know if that's changeable. Like I think tech companies just are in crisis mode all the time because they're so agile, they're always making change. I don't know if that's possible to change. What I will say is, I think that we need to develop really clear standards about what management is responsible for, especially if you have a lot of new managers who grew out of individual contributor roles. You really got to make clear what they're responsible for and how they can do it. And then what people ops is responsible for them and how they should do that role. Because, I think sometimes these coaching conversations that I've found to be very valuable and managers have found to be very valuable are just seen as, empty calendar time to our senior leadership. And that's no fault to them. I understand that we have a lot of proactive things we want to do, but you kind of got to say, like, do you want coaching and support from people ops, or are you saying that resources aren't really there for that? Managers are kind of on their own. Let's have, they can talk to their managers. Let's have you instead focus on proactive projects. Maybe that's a pendulum. And right now I'm swinging further into the project oriented work.
yeah.
But yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge.
I guess it is. And so I think in companies that are, particularly agile, by definition, they're continuously, changing priorities and it seems like they're in continual crisis mode. But I think that a lot of the certainty in those kind of companies comes from the process and from the backbone that, for example, Scrum can be. And
Mm-hmm.
would you say, or would you agree that it's the manager's job to combine, to combine that crisis mode or to create clarity in that crisis environment,
Mm-hmm.
first of all, and then secondly, support people as much as possible into, performing their tasks, getting better at what
Mm-hmm.
they're supposed to do. I think for me, those are the two most important elements as a manager in that agile context. I don't know how you look at those, manager skills in an agile context.
Do you think that remains steady through growth though? Like, do you think that process, the defined process, scales up as you grow as a company quickly? I
I
think
think
that's
it,
the question for me.
I think it never does. But if a manager doesn't have the clarity around the process that's used to manage all of the, risk and all of the, let's say, urgent stuff that comes up,
Mm-hmm.
then there's no certainty at all. And without certainty, your company, I mean, everybody explodes, so to say.
Mm-hmm.
It's just
Mm-hmm.
very dangerous to have a situation without any sort of certainty. And if your certainty can't come from the kind of products you make, or even the kind of tasks you have to do on a daily basis, because that changes all
Mm-hmm.
the time, then your certainty has to come from the manager and has to come from at least some sort of process that's defined, right? So
Yeah.
would you argue that HR can even support managers in creating that process for their team, giving tips and tricks on how can you create that vision, how can you create that process?
Yes, I think absolutely. In fact, my boss, our VP of finance, we were just talking about, part of the challenge that we've seen as we've grown is, you know, I think it's cyclical. I think processes are cyclical, how effective they are. And so I've been there for 2 years. We've probably changed our company-wide process 3 or 4 times. Last year, we used something called the Summit system, where it was a monthly cadence, and you would join a expedition, and you'd go up to Summit together for 4 weeks, and then we'd do a demo of your work, and then repeat. And there were some real challenges there, but it worked really well for about 6 to 9 months. And at some point, it stopped working. I don't really know why. I think some of their outcomes were really strong, but other ones just started kind of tapering off. And so we had to change process, and we kind of did. Now we have a really strong process again, but we're all still kind of adjusting to it. So there was this 6 to 9 month gap of, listlessness for maybe half the company, and that's really challenging. So my boss and I were talking about how much of these processes should be company-wide, how much of them should come from values and culture, and how much of them should be team oriented or even like sub-team oriented, and how much should be coming from like values and culture of those sub-teams. So we have a group of remote employees that works primarily on operations improvement and saving us money effectively in our different engineering processes. And they have a very distinct culture because they're all remote. They work on very specific projects. They're kind of like this awesome, congruent sub team. But I don't think that they're really, they are aligned with the overall process we have, but they're kind of really distinct. So I think in that case, the engineering team manager and the sub team manager have done an awesome job figuring out very clearly what should happen in any situation. It doesn't even matter what happens at the company level. What happens at that narrow level is what matters. I don't think that's true for something like sales or customer happiness, because they're always going to be, working on this, reactive work they have to manage. And that part will always be happening. But in terms of like how they proactively sell or how they proactively solve problems or write documentation or anything that they do in this, business as usual work, they will always be subject to the company-wide culture and values and process. So I think you need both. But what I would say is if a team doesn't feel like they can work because of a company-wide gap, work with the HR person immediately to get that resolved, or just do it. Just like create your process and define it. Because in the absence of it, you're just not going to get stuff done unless you do. And I think lots of HR people know that and can help like surface things to senior leadership when they say like, hey, actually engineering's got a great thing here. Why don't we all start doing something like that? Because, what we have now isn't really seeing results.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. For me, when I say clarity in process, I mean the micro process, specifically how are you going to manage the
Yes.
team, how are you going to create clarity in the team, because company processes or HR processes they do get in the way of team effectiveness every now and then.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Aaron, we've been going at it for over half an hour now, so I think it's about time to wrap up. Is there maybe anything else you'd like to share to HR managers that are looking for a more digital experience for their employees, a more leadership that's more attuned to that digital continuous changing situation? Anything you'd like to share in the end?
Yeah. What I think a lot about is where will we be in 10 years? And it's very clear that this next decade will be significantly different, and we'll see significant change from other decades. Like, obviously things are changing exponentially, but you can see these numbers getting published and updated every day. Most people are going to remote work. Most millennials want to be able to work in this remote situation, or they want flex time. Where I think we're all getting better about, especially in the US, understanding that people have appointments and families. And if you don't understand that, you're not going to be able to create an environment that people want to work at. You will lose competitively. The recruiting is getting harder and harder. Just this week, I saw that Indeed is going to start posting the diversity scores for different companies on job listings. You have got to create an inclusive environment now if you want to be able to get, half, 3/4 of the population of your region. You just got to be able to show with data that you're working on this. And so I think we have to stay on top of these trends in order to both remain competitive and just make good places to work, because the biggest community for most people in the US is their workplace. It is a place to like see results and make an effect in the economy, but this is a community. You make friends at work. And if we don't set up systems that keep that going, you're going to have more like alienation from people working remotely that feel like lost. And we see this like, annual churn from people that don't have that anchor. So I honestly think the pendulum's shifting back. Let's make a great workplace where people want to come and build their community, but also get great stuff done in an honest, candid way. That's what I think that we're heading towards, and I'm really excited. I think that we have a lot of wonderful people in this industry. So, yeah.
That's a call to action like I've never heard one before. if that doesn't create urgency, I don't know what will, Aaron. So,
I know.
yeah, so, and if not, people can always call you to ask for some further advice, right?
Always. Right. Tweet me, LinkedIn, whatever. Call me.
That's good. And if they need some acting jobs, like maybe something that I wanted to ask in the beginning, but I forgot. Do you feel like you can use your acting skills for the job right now?
One of my favorite things in corporate training is improv.
Oh yeah.
Strongly recommend you do improv with people, because there's no better way to be candid than to like have to say things off the top of your like head in like a situation with people that you're a little nervous about.
Oh yeah, because they have to show vulnerability, and magic stuff happens when yeah.
And I think it creates the like immediate positive bond. So yeah, there's a lot of room there.
All right, I'm glad I asked. I'm glad I asked the question. I asked the question in the end. So. All right, it was awesome talking to you, and we'll talk to each other soon, I guess.
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you so much. This is so fun.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. See you later.
All right.
Bye.